a minimum point of energy, but that at the same time didn't resemble them at all. In some cases this was a sphere, in other cases this was a cube. Light, for instance, also tends to follow the path of a minimum travel time, what is called a geodesic. Rays of light are typically either straight, or if they are a little curved, it is the curve that minimizes traveling time. So a ray of light called a geodesic can also be represented by diphase space. So when Deleuze looked at this, he immediately saw what he needed. Because he needed a way of thinking about a space of possibilities, and this is a space of possibilities. Remember, every point is a possible state for the pendulum, a possible state for the cell bubble, a possible state for the cube, for the crystals. But at the same time, the space of possibilities has a structure, and that structure accounts for the fact that there's a recurrent form that appears over and over again. Cell bubbles are always spherical, salt crystals are always cubic, light rays are always geodesics, either straight lines or slightly curved straight lines, depending on the form of space. And so, when he was trying to imagine what he needed to think about that immanent spirituality, he realized that these diagrams, phase-space diagrams, are exactly what he needed. Because he needed something that, on the one hand, was not metric, something that was not like a cell bubble, or something that was not like a cube, something that was not like a straight line. You know, these things have lengths, have radiuses, are metric. It needed to be something that was not metric, but that could give rise to those metric spaces, or that could capture, if you want, the structure of the process that gives rise to these metric forms. A process of minimization of surface energy, a process of minimization of bonding energy, a process of minimization of traveling time, in the case of the yeah.
Couldn't we say, in that infinite space of possibilities, that kind of abstract design that comes out depending on what we put in and its degrees of freedom, isn't that image that we get, non-linear image, its essence?
Yes, it is, except that it is a kind of topological essence, if you wish.
What's the difference between that topological essence and a
let me tell you the distinction between these essences and your regular Platonic essence. In your regular Platonic essence, the essence of the bubble would resemble the bubble, because it would be the essence of a sphericity. And so you would have a perfect sphere living in some kind of transcendent space, and then every sphere in the planet would be an actualization, a realization of that essence, but more or less imperfect realizations. You know, this sphere has a little part broken here, this other one has a little, you know, it's not exactly spherical, you know. The perfect sphere is in heaven. All the spheres resemble it to different degrees, but they are all imperfect realizations of a perfect sphere. What Deleuze saw here is that these topological essences did not resemble what they were creating, because they can become spheres in one case, but they can also become cubes. They can also become straight lines. They can become all kinds of different things, and therefore now the relationship of resemblance between one and the other was broken. And so yes, we can say that they are essences, although I'm going to have to qualify that in a minute. So Poincaré continued to investigate, and the next thing he discovered was that there were singularities that, instead of being a point, were a line, and specifically a line that closed on itself, a loop, a closed loop. And he called them periodic attractors. One realization of this periodic attractor, and now the drawing is not going to be very good, but would be a radio transmitter. Let's imagine that was a radio transmitter, okay? Now it looks more like a square Martian, but this is the antenna, and that's the speaker or whatever, and those are the buttons that you tune, right? When you take, today we don't really, none of us uses, CD radios, we don't transmit anything, and most of the radio we hear today is through the internet, so it's really ones and zeros traveling through a cable. But in the early part of the 20th century, radios were magical devices. It was the first time that you could, send a message, and someone else in a completely different part of the world, without any wires attaching the one machine to the other, could get your message. It's like the messages were traveling through the air, right? They were called wireless devices. They had a variety of different names, but they were always seen with awe, as if they were magical. Like the first time you saw a TV show, or the first time you saw something in the internet. Radios, and of course radios were, soap operas were invented, and were all kinds of narratives, that were of continuation. You would, synchronize your radio one day to hear one story, and then the continuation of the story the following day. The radios were part of the life of every household. They occupied a place in the center of the living room, just like eventually television would occupy that same place. So radios were important. They were important militarily, in the sense that they allowed the dispersion of troops, so you could be communicating with them via walkie-talkies. When you turn, now we're talking about radio transmitters, not radio receivers. Most of us when you owned a radio when you were a kid, at the most, a radio receiver. And the receiver in the radio in your car is already a radio receiver. But somebody has to be having a radio transmitter, otherwise you will not be receiving anything. The radio station has the radio transmitter, right? Now the way a radio works is you connect to the wall, you turn it on, it at first goes to some kind of random noises that engineers call transients, but it eventually settles into a stable pulsation. It begins emitting spherical electromagnetic waves, 1, 2, 3, 4, constantly. The radio is basically pulsating like a heart. Of course, in this case, would be electricity that's pulsating inside the radio, right? But it is emitting wave after wave after wave after wave. Those waves, those sequences of waves, is what is called the signal of the radio. Just like when you have your cell phone and you're trying to get a signal. Well, that signal is just trying to capture electromagnetic waves, sent to you by a satellite. Then on top of those waves, you can now put music. You can now put some actors acting in a soap opera. You can now put a radio commercial by modulating either the amplitude of the spherical waves, and that's AM radio, amplitude modulation, or by modulating the frequency. So you have FM radio. So you have two choices, and those were the two choices we had all our lives. You could either hear to cheapo AM radio, or you could read to the slightly more expensive FM radio, which eventually became just like AM radio, because it also had commercials and so on. But it is two ways of piggybacking messages on top of those waves that the radio is transmitting. So let's forget about the messages right now for a second, since those are something you piggyback on the signal, and think about the signal itself. For the radio to work, it needs to pulsate with a very precise clock-like accuracy. 1 wave, 2 waves, 3 waves, 4 waves, 5 waves, 7 waves, very precisely. When you put to the 2 dimensions, the degree of electrical voltage and the other degree of freedom of radius inside, and you then plot the trajectories, you will find that the trajectories first kind of snake, those are the transients, the radio kind of not knowing what to do, until the radio is captured by the attractor and begins going around, 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 around. That's once the radio has reached the attractor, that's when the radio is working right. It has a stable pulsation, a stable emission of a signal that is a lot of